The understanding of the structures and functions of the human body is one of the most important facets of medicine still heavily relied upon to this day. Without knowledge of the locations and functions of the many complex systems that allow us to physically and mentally operate on a day-to-day basis, accurately diagnosing the causes of dysfunction within the body is nearly impossible. As far back as 25,000 years ago, Stone Age human remains, namely skulls, have shown evidence of trephination, or removing a section of the skull to allow access to the brain, with some examples displaying new bone growth around the carved-out area of the skull, suggesting that some of these ancient patients perhaps survived a form of prehistoric brain surgery. Other examples of early human dissection are known, such as the ancient Egyptians, who often prepared their dead by removing the organs for the purpose of mummification, though they are believed to have not understood the importance of internal organs. It was not until the Hellenistic period following Alexander the Great's death and the founding of Alexandria, where the first official school of anatomy was established. It was here that an inquisitive young Herophilus arrived with aspirations to practice medicine. Herophilus would go on to become the first known medical practitioner to dissect the human body with the intent of gaining knowledge from their findings during an ancient time when such a thing was considered taboo or even heretical. His acknowledgement and discernment of different anatomical structures such as the nervous system, blood vessels, digestive organs, reproductive systems, and parts of the human eye earned him the posthumous title, the Father of Anatomy. And while contemporaries would perceive Herophilus' morbid yet groundbreaking work as anything short of repulsive, they would have no idea the level anatomists and their constituents would go to dissect bodies in the centuries to come, when not only medical innovations and discoveries were on the line, but a hefty profit as well, most notably in the 19th century, during a period of great transformation in the medical field. Vile acts in the names of science and financial gain would range everywhere from grave robbing to cold-blooded murder. These were the lives and times of the Body Snatchers, a true horror in history. By the 3rd century BC, ancient anatomists were dismayed to see that the practice of human dissection was being outlawed by governments, no matter the cause or intention. Opposing schools of physicians condemned the practice as impractical, and societal customs saw the intimate study of the human body and its internal workings after or before the soul had departed as a desecration. Other reservations about dissection, including the rising knowledge that exposed corpses spread disease. Therefore, many early anatomists were relegated to dissecting animals. Anatomists such as Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician of the 2nd century. While Galen contributed vast amounts of knowledge towards the medical community, knowledge that would dominate schools of medicine until the 16th century, his findings would come at a fault, being that he could only study the human body through grievously wounded gladiators and other combatants, along with the legal mandate of only dissecting animal cadavers, operating on the prospect that human and animal organs were essentially the same. This would change during the Dark Ages, when much of Europe suffered great losses of knowledge following the collapse of the Roman Empire, and many notable scholars found new academic refuge elsewhere, such as in Middle Eastern metropolises like Baghdad, where many new findings related to human physiology were discovered. Opportunity for aspiring anatomists and clinicians vying for their own original discoveries became more achievable when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II would decree in 1231 that one cadaver every 5 years could be dissected for medical purposes. This loosening of restrictions would continue across the known world over the next few centuries, though with church and state still firmly tied together in many places. Morality and method continued to see a troubled mix, with approvals needed from religious leaders to release a human body for dissection, being sourced from a small pool of deceased candidates, primarily executed criminals. The study of anatomy continued to straggle along without much aplomb until 1543, when Andreas Vesalius published his work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, the first comprehensive, realistically illustrated text on anatomy that opened many eyes to the practical usefulness of dissection, that created a riveting argument for the intimate understanding of the human body's internal workings. Advancements in the field and further credibility gained by anatomists soon grew the demand for cadavers. However, due to continued limitations from enduring laws, supply began to fall well short of growing demand. So began one of the darkest chapters in the history of modern medicine. As the world entered the early modern period following the Middle Ages, and the field of science gained ground as an understood practicality to not only understanding the world around us, but understanding ourselves in particular, many prominent universities, such as Cambridge and London, began to formally establish schools for anatomy, including human dissections. These developments only compounded the supply issue of readily available cadavers for study, as newly minted institutions clamored for corpses. This conundrum presented a great opportunity for grave-robbing body snatchers, or more colloquially known, resurrectionists. Tasked by hospitals and prestigious anatomists, starving for deceased flesh to open and study, these sordid grave robbers would be paid handsomely to enter cemeteries under the dead of night to exhume freshly buried corpses before decomposition set in. One country where such devious activity ran rampant was the United Kingdom. Here, Parliament's passing of the Murder Act of 1752, a sort of deterrence for criminals against murder, deviated from previous centuries wherein executed killers would simply be hanged from gibbets on display for the public to see. The Murder Act instead dictated by law that executed murderers could be sent to universities to be anatomized, a fate thought at the time to be worse than death. However, even with this new avenue of cadavers available to anatomists, supply could still not keep up with demand. So, for the philanthropic betterment of humanity, authorities would turn a blind eye to a growing underground market in dead flesh. Word of grave robbing through the communities would be suppressed, leaving mourning individuals up to their own devices in deterring these body snatchers from stealing away the consecrated remains of their loved ones. To do this, citizens began installing mort safes over the graves of buried people, metal cages that prevented resurrectionists' access to the bodies. However, not even this was able to deter grave robbers from simply digging around the protective bars to access the head of the coffin, where they would affix a hook around the body before yanking it out of the grave. Many grieving family members, therefore, would be forced to take turns standing watch through many nights over their buried ones' headstones in case the resurrectionists paid a visit. And even while anatomists still proceeded to obtain the corpses of convicted criminals from the gallows, anger within the community over the grave robbers would lead to riots at execution sites, anyone attempting to remove the body in danger of being lynched. This dark trade within the ever-advancing medical community would not only occur in the UK and Europe. America, having recently gained its sovereignty from the Revolutionary War, was establishing its own accoladed universities, filled with cadaver-hungry professors and their student bodies. In 1828, America was once again revolutionized following the opening of railroad lines, like the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, connecting businesses and peoples across the continent like never before. With reputable schools like Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland, exhumed bodies became a mail-order business. Corpses could be exhumed elsewhere in the country before being squeezed into whiskey barrels, which masked any odors and offered some preservation, before being loaded into train cars to be transferred to hospitals and schools. Like Johns Hopkins, once the bodies were removed from the whiskey, the remaining corpse-seasoned spirit could then find itself sold to imbibers as something they like to call a stiff drink. Hired hands of the medical schools and hospitals would mobilize into Baltimore cemeteries under the cover of night, pillaging fresh graves with near impunity despite the public's disdain for such acts. Prosecutions rarely occurred. Politicians let grave-digging incidents slip through the cracks, as did judges. Lawyers knew the laws well enough to argue in support of it, and at times, cemeteries were in on the anatomical black market. In Europe, Scotland, and the UK, there were more rooted, standardized practices for acquiring cadavers for medical research in a modernizing age, as countries such as America were still in their governmental infancy. However, these standards would not perturb body snatchers from seeking even darker methods for acquiring the flesh of the deceased. Body snatchers like the infamous William Burke and William Hare. Both Irish immigrants to Scotland, Burke and Hare would enter into a partnership of death when Burke sought a room at Hare's lodgings in Edinburgh. When a rent-skipping tenant suddenly died under his roof, Hare enlisted Burke's assistance of selling the body to Robert Knox, a renowned Scottish anatomist. Receiving £7 10 shillings, roughly around £1,300 today, the two budding body snatchers realized they could make good money in such a lurid trade, if they didn't mind getting their hands dirty. Within a year, Burke and Hare, with aid from their wives, would go on to take the lives of 16 lodging travelers and local acquaintances they would lure back to Hare's inn. Befriending each one, the two would ply their victims with alcohol until they were heavily intoxicated, before smothering them to death in order to mitigate damage to the body so they could sell it in good condition to their anatomist benefactor, Knox. But Burke and Hare became drunk with greed, and their methods in dispatching their victims would soon catch up to them. One of the duo's final victims was 18-year-old James Wilson, a beggar with a clubbed foot and a mental disorder. Locals found him affable enough and knew him well. He was coaxed back to Hare's lodgings with promises of whiskey, but because the young man wasn't a big drinker, he did not overindulge, Burke and Hare having to overpower and kill him while he was fully conscious. Medical assistants at Knox's lab were perplexed in seeing Wilson's body when it was delivered by Burke and Hare, having recognized him. When reports began to circulate that Wilson was missing, Knox curiously removed the boy's head and clubbed feet before dissecting him. During their murder spree, Burke and Hare had a number of contentious spats, largely owed to Burke finding out that Hare had been trading bodies without his knowledge, cutting him out of the profits. This led Burke to open his own lodgings to lure victims to. On October 31st, 1828, Burke had met and befriended Irish-born Margaret Docherty, an older woman with little to no friends or relatives, and a perfect target for a couple of serial killers. Burke and his wife drank whiskey with the woman in his lodgings late into the night. After a time, Burke left the woman with his wife in order to collect Hare. When both men arrived back, they paid off a couple who were staying with Burke to instead take up a room at Hare's, leaving the men alone with their intended victim. They killed Margaret that night and hid her body under a pile of hay in the establishment. The next morning, the couple they paid to stay at Hare's returned to gather some of their belongings they left behind. After being refused entry to collect their things, they broke into the lodging and discovered Margaret's body, spurring them to seek out the authorities. When the authorities arrived, Burke and Hare had already sold the body to Knox. Suspecting foul play, the police searched the dissecting rooms of local anatomists and discovered Margaret's body under the care of Robert Knox. Burke and Hare were subsequently arrested, and both immediately turned on each other during questioning. The prosecution relied on a tried-and-true method of convicting criminal cases involving multiple suspects, called turning the king's evidence, or using one suspect's confession to convict others, while granting that chosen suspect clemency or full immunity from prosecution. Hare was chosen to be this most fortunate suspect, who would go on to give a full account of the murders he, Burke, and their wives committed, leaving Robert Knox out of the ordeal, citing his lack of knowledge regarding how exactly the bodies were procured. And because law forbid Hare to testify against his own wife, she too would be given the same immunity deal. All charges then fell on William Burke and his wife, specifically for the murders of Margaret Docherty, James Wilson, and a third victim, Mary Paterson. The case shocked and equally enthralled the entire country, Burke's trial commencing on Christmas Eve, 1828. Large crowds gathered around the courthouse as Burke was sentenced. His own accomplice in the murders, Hare, would even take the stand as a testifying witness, fully laying the murders on Burke and his wife alone, having no obligation to incriminate himself due to his immunity deal with authorities. So on Christmas Day, Burke was sentenced to death by hanging and was to be publicly anatomized as a way to truly appreciate the atrociousness of his crimes. His wife was acquitted of charges, given that no proof could be presented of her complicity, and she was released. However, the following day, she would be accosted by angry mobs who sought their own justice, and she was all but run out of town, the rest of her story lost to history. Hare and his wife, having escaped justice, faced their own experiences of fury from the local populace after a lengthy yet temporary stay in jail, mostly for their own protection. Hare's wife is said to have been attacked by an angry mob once freed, and required a police escort to a departing ship from Scotland. Hare was the target of similar mob violence after his release, and after being escorted out of town by the authorities, he was dropped off on a road and told to walk to England. The remainder of his life, to this day, is unknown past this point. Burke's body was dissected in front of many students at a local medical school, his skeleton preserved, still on display to this day. A death mask was created of his face prior to dissection, which was also put on display, including a book said to be bound in Burke's own tanned skin. As for their benefactor anatomist, Robert Knox, despite his judged innocence by the court, his revealed association with Burke and Hare, along with his dissecting of their victims, ruined his reputation and career. He was disbarred from the Edinburgh medical community and moved to London, where he lived until his death, under the shadow of his former life. The Burke and Hare killings, contemporarily known as the Westport murders, made disturbing waves through the world of anatomy. Copycat murderers emerged in London, for example, specifically the Bethnal Green gang. Body snatchers turned killers, gaining the public's eye in 1831, following their apprehension by authorities, when they sold the fresh body of a 14-year-old boy to a local anatomist. They admitted to and were found guilty of multiple murders, employing similar methods as Burke and Hare, drugging and intoxicating their victims before drowning them in a well and then selling their bodies. Some were hanged for their crimes, others shipped off to British prison colonies abroad. As more copycat murders took place around the discovery efforts in anatomy, and more hangings of body-snatching serial killers proceeded, the Anatomy Act was passed in 1832 by British Parliament, essentially regulating the study of anatomy by the government, which in turn squeezed out the body snatchers from their business. However, concerns still permeated the public, leading to arsonists burning down some anatomical theaters and vandalizing others. By the 1840s, body snatching had all but ceased in the United Kingdom. Stateside, the U.S. was still catching up with its anatomy reform, but eventually followed Britain's suit. News of America's own grave-robbing depravity didn't quite reach enough lawmakers' ears until the late 1870s, when a U.S. senator's body was exhumed and sold off by grave robbers. In today's modern world, anatomical research continues with as much, if not more, priority than ever before. For research purposes, a person can now go through a legal process of opting into donating their whole body after death. Of course, with so many technological advancements and gains of knowledge over the last few centuries, the study of the human body has become quite advanced. Donated cadavers finding their way into medical schools, being subjected to experimental treatments, and giving students opportunities to practice a multitude of surgical procedures on real human flesh. And it's all thanks to the depraved efforts of leading medical figures of the past that has led us to the understanding and advancements of our own biology that we have today, making the body snatchers and the world they thrived in a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider subscribing today. And if you have any shocking or scary stories you would like to see covered on the channel, feel free to let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.